Paris, the 28th of December, 1895. In the basement of a cafe on the Boulevard des Capucines, a small audience sits in the dark while a machine begins to whir. A train arrives at a station. A wall of workers pours out of a factory gate. The images are gray, silent, and barely a minute long, and the people watching them are said to be the first human beings ever to see photographs move. That is the story we tell ourselves. Motion pictures as a modern miracle. Animation as the child of electricity and celluloid, of Disney and Pixar, of engineers and inventors who finally solved a puzzle that had defeated everyone before them. But roughly 300 miles south of that cafe, in a limestone valley in southwestern France, there is a small disc of bone. It is about the size of a large coin. It has a hole punched through the center. On one side, someone has carefully engraved a hoofed animal, a young chamois, most likely, lying down with its legs folded beneath it. Turn the disc over, and the same animal is there again, standing. Middle. The disc was made at least 14,000 years before that evening in Paris. And for more than a century, it sat in a museum drawer, catalogued as decoration. Then somebody threaded a cord through the hole and spun it. To understand why that moment matters, you have to understand how simple the trick of animation really is. Not the industry, not the cameras. The trick itself. In the 1820s, London was gripped by a craze for optical toys. The most successful of them was a flat cardboard disc with two strings attached to opposite edges. On one side of the disc, an artist painted an empty bird cage. On the other, a bird. Twist the strings, let them unwind, and the disc spins so quickly that both faces seem to occupy the same instant. The bird appears inside the cage. It was marketed under the name Thaumatrope, from Greek roots meaning wonder, turner, and it made a physician named John Ayrton Paris a small fortune. What followed was a cascade. In 1834, a British mathematician built a slotted drum lined with a strip of drawings. Spin it, peer through the slots, and a figure inside walks endlessly. He called it the Wheel of the Devil. We call it the Zoetrope. Decades later, a shy Frenchman named Émile Reynaud refined the idea into something extraordinary. A machine of mirrors and hand-painted transparent bands that could project a moving story onto a screen for an audience. In 1892, in a wax museum in Paris, he was showing animated films to paying crowds, 3 years before the Lumière brothers ever arrived at that cafe. His story ends sadly. As cinema swallowed the world, Reynaud's delicate theater of mirrors was forgotten. In his final years, ruined and ill, he destroyed the machine himself and threw the pieces into the Seine. Only 2 of his hand-painted films survive. But notice something about that entire chain of invention. The zoetrope, the praxinoscope, the projector, the camera, those are technologies. The thaumatrope is not. A thaumatrope is a flat object with 2 pictures and a hole in it. There is no lens, no shutter, no mechanism, no chemistry. There is nothing in a thaumatrope that a person with a sharp flint and a piece of bone could not make. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the illusion of movement requires no technology at all, only 2 images, a spin and a human eye, then why would we assume nobody discovered it until 1825? Return now to the Vézère Valley in the Dordogne, a landscape of pale cliffs and overhanging rock shelters that has produced more Ice Age art than almost anywhere on Earth. In the 1800s, excavators working at a shelter called La Jarrie, Boss pulled a remarkable quantity of carved objects from the ground: harpoons, spear, throwers, engraved stones, and small pierced discs cut from the flat bone of animal shoulder blades. Archaeologists gave these discs a name that reveals how little they understood them: rondelles, little rounds. Dozens have since been recovered across France and northern Spain, from sites in the Pyrenees to caves in the foothills of the Ariège. Some carry geometric patterns, some carry animals. Nearly all of them have that central hole. For 100 years, the standard interpretation was the obvious one. They were pendants, ornaments, perhaps buttons, or spindle weights, or objects of unknown ceremonial value. They were beautiful, and they were filed away. The rondelle from La Jarrie, Boss, is different, and the difference is precise. The animal on one face is not merely a similar animal to the one on the other face. It is the same animal in a different position, legs tucked beneath the body on one side, legs extended, and body raised on the other. And the 2 engravings are aligned so that when the disc turns, the 2 bodies fall into the same place, head over head, spine over spine. Picture that for a moment. A hunter-gatherer sitting in the mouth of a rock shelter with the river below, holding a bone disc the width of 2 fingers, deciding not just what to draw, but where on the reverse side the second drawing has to sit for the effect to work. The first person to look at that object and think of the London toy shops of the 1820s was not a museum curator. He was a French archaeologist named Marc Azéma, who had spent much of his career doing something slightly unusual for his profession. He also made films. Azéma had noticed, over years of studying Paleolithic imagery, that a great deal of it seemed to break a rule he had been taught. Cave art was supposed to be a gallery of portraits, individual animals rendered with astonishing anatomical accuracy but frozen, like specimens. That was not what he kept seeing. He kept seeing repetition, bodies overlapping bodies, heads drawn twice, slightly displaced, legs multiplied beyond any anatomical possibility. In the language of his other profession, he was not looking at portraits, he was looking at frames. Working with an artist and experimental craftsman named Florent Rivère, Azéma turned to the rondelles. Rivère made replicas using the same materials and methods: bone from a large mammal, flint tools, engraving by hand. Then he threaded cords of twisted sinew through the central holes, wound them tight, and let them go. The chamois stood up. It lay down. It stood up again. Not as two pictures alternating, but as a single small animal rising and settling, over and over, in a loop that could be kept going as long as the fingers kept working. Azéma and Rivère went further. They argued that the central hole itself carries a clue. A pendant hung around the neck wears in one direction. The cord pulls downward, and the hole elongates toward the edge. A spun disc wears differently, because the cord is pulling outward from both sides and twisting. On some rondelles, they suggested, the wear pattern and the small notches on the rim fit spinning better than hanging. This is where honesty matters more than drama. That reading is a hypothesis, not a verdict. Wear patterns on Ice Age bone are notoriously difficult to interpret. Thousands of years of burial can alter a surface, and plenty of specialists remain unconvinced that any Paleolithic disc was ever deliberately spun. Azéma's proposal has never become the consensus, but the object exists. The two positions of the same animal exist. The alignment exists, and nobody has produced a better explanation for why a Stone Age artist would engrave a resting animal on one face of a disc and a rising animal on the exact opposite face, oriented to match. So what, precisely, would those people have discovered? For most of the last 2 centuries, the standard answer was persistence of vision, the idea that the eye holds an image for a fraction of a second after the light has gone, so that rapidly presented pictures overlap into continuity. There is a grain of truth in it. Look at a bright window, then close your eyes, and the shape lingers. But that explanation turned out to be far too simple, and the person who broke it open was a psychologist named Max Wertheimer. In 1912, according to the story he told, he was traveling by train when he became preoccupied with a question about how we perceive movement, bought a simple optical toy at a station stop, and began experimenting in a hotel room. What he demonstrated afterwards was startling. Flash 2 stationary lights in sequence, with the right gap between them, and a viewer does not see 2 lights. They see one light traveling. There is no image in the space between. The motion is manufactured, not by the eye, but by the brain. We now know the visual system contains circuitry devoted specifically to detecting motion, cells that respond to change and direction rather than to shape. Movement is not something we deduce from a series of still pictures. It is something we are built to see, sometimes whether it is there or not. Which turns the whole question upside down. Animation was never a technology waiting to be invented. It is a property of the human nervous system, present in every one of us, waiting to be noticed. The apparatus is not the disc or the projector. The apparatus is us. And if that is true, then the only real question is when somebody first noticed, and whether they thought it was worth doing again. Now the story leaves the small objects behind and walks into the dark. On the 24th of December, 1994, 3 cavers exploring a cliff above a dry river gorge in the Ardèche felt air moving from a gap in the rubble. They cleared it, squeezed through, and dropped into a chamber that had been sealed by a rockfall for tens of thousands of years. The floor was scattered with the bones of animals that no longer exist in Europe. The walls were covered in art. Chauvet Cave is among the oldest painted caves known, with images reaching back some 36,000 years, and on one of its panels there is a bison. It has 8 legs. Not a deformity, not 2 overlapping animals. A single body, a single head, a single hump, and beneath it, 2 complete sets of legs, drawn in different positions, one pair behind the other. Elsewhere in the cave, a rhinoceros carries a fan of repeated horn lines sweeping through the air in front of it, like a stroboscopic trace. Lions appear with doubled outlines. Heads are drawn twice, slightly offset, so that a single animal seems to be turning. Azéma spent years cataloging this, and he identified 2 distinct techniques used again and again in French caves. In the first, successive positions of an animal are placed side by side, as if along a strip. In the second, the more startling one, successive positions are drawn on top of each other, sharing a single body so that all the moments of a movement occupy the same outline at once. That second method has a name in modern animation. Artists call it superimposition, or a smear, or multiple exposure, the deliberate overlapping of positions to communicate speed. It is what a cartoonist does when a running character sprouts a blur of extra feet. When the film maker Werner Herzog was allowed into Chauvet with a camera, he stopped in front of that bison and called it proto-cinema. It was a poetic claim from a poetic man. But he was standing in front of an animal that a human being 36,000 years ago had chosen to draw with more legs than it possessed, and there are only so many reasons to do that. Which brings us to the objection, and it is a strong one. Cave walls are palimpsests. In many caves, images were added over centuries, even millennia, by different people who never met. Animals were painted across older animals with apparent indifference. A modern eye, scanning a chaos of superimposed lines, is exquisitely well trained to find sequence where there is only accumulation. We grew up on flip, books, and film strips. We are the most motion-literate species that has ever existed, and we may simply be projecting our own visual grammar onto rock. There is a deeper trap, too. The history of prehistoric archaeology is littered with confident interpretations that turned out to be self-portraits. Victorian scholars saw primitive savages, 19th century romantics saw noble hunters, mid-century thinkers saw hunting magic, or fertility rites, or shamanic trance, each explanation fitting the anxieties of its own decade with suspicious neatness. Now, in an age of screens, we look at a wall of overlapping animals and see a timeline. So the septical position deserves its full weight. Some superimpositions are certainly accidental. Some rondelles were certainly ornaments. Extra legs can be corrections, or apprentices' work, or a way of showing a herd rather than a stride, or conventions whose meaning is simply lost. And yet the 8-legged bison is not a random tangle. Its extra legs are anatomically coherent and deliberately placed. The chameau on the bone disc is not a coincidence of geometry. In both cases, someone made a choice that only pays off if the image is meant to be read as changing. There is one more element the septics have to account for, and it is the element every one of us forgets, because we have never seen these paintings the way they were made to be seen. We know cave art from photographs. Flat, even, floodlit, every line equally visible, the whole panel at once, the colors corrected. It is the single most misleading thing about the entire subject. There is no daylight in a deep cave. There never was. Every image in Lascaux, in Chauvet, in Altamira, in Yo, was made and viewed by fire. At Lascaux alone, excavators recovered more than 100 lamps and lamp fragments, shallow stone dishes that burned animal fat with a wick of juniper or moss. Add torches of resinous pine and small hearths on the cave floor, and you have the only lighting technology available to a human being for tens of thousands of years. Fire does not illuminate. Fire flickers. It moves constantly, in every axis, at frequencies that shift with every draft. Hold a burning wick near a curved limestone wall, and the shadows inside every engraved groove swell and shrink. The highlights slide across the stone, and the surface will not hold still. An archaeologist named Andy Needham became interested in a set of small engraved stones from a French site called Montestruc, flat plaquettes about 15,000 years old, incised with horses and deer. Something about them had never been explained. They showed distinctive pink discoloration and heat, cracking, the signature of stone that has sat close to a fire, repeatedly, without being burned in it. They had not been dropped into a hearth by accident. They had been kept beside one. And when his team recreated the conditions, engraved stone, low flickering flame, darkness, the effect was not subtle. The animals on the plaquettes appeared to shift, overlapping lines that look like clutter in a photograph resolve, in moving light, into limbs that seem to swing. The human eye in near darkness behaves differently too. Color vision fades, peripheral sensitivity rises, and the visual system becomes hungrier for motion, more willing to complete a pattern. Now put yourself in the passage. Imagine crawling several hundred meters into a mountain, the air cold and unmoving, carrying a stone lamp the size of your palm, with a flame no bigger than a thumbnail. The walls arrive one patch at a time. And then, as you lift the lamp, the swell of the rock becomes the shoulder of a bison, and the shadow in a carved line slides, and for a moment the animal breathes. The Ice Age artists knew this. At Altamira, on the great painted ceiling, natural bulges in the limestone were used as the flanks and haunches of bison, so that the animals are half sculpture, half painting, and the light does most of the work. That is not decoration. That is direction, a person deciding what an audience will see and when, and by what light. If following ideas like this into the strange corners of human history sharpens the way you see the present, consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps these longer, slower stories find the people who want to sit with a difficult question rather than a quick answer. Now, back into the dark. Because there is a question we have not yet asked, and it is the one that makes everything else make sense. Why would movement matter so much to these people in the first place? We treat animation as entertainment. For a hunting society in Ice Age Europe, motion was information, and the difference between reading it well and reading it badly was the difference between eating and not eating. Consider what an experienced hunter actually knows, not what a horse looks like. What a horse looks like when it is about to bolt, the tightening before the run, the stiff-legged display of a rutting stag, the way a bison lowers its head before it charges, rather than retreats. The gait of an injured animal, which marks it as the one you can catch, the particular posture of a female close to giving birth, the season written into the swelling of a neck, or the shedding of a coat. None of that is visible in a portrait. All of it lives in movement. So when a Paleolithic artist drew an animal, the interesting question was never simply what species it was. Their images are full of details a naturalist would admire: the correct number of horn rings, the seasonal coat of a reindeer, the shape of a mammoth's ear. These were people who observed with terrifying precision, and what they were most precise about, again and again, is behavior. Animals fighting, animals in rut, animals swimming with only their heads above the waterline, a herd flowing in one direction. Keduli in our terms, they were not painting nouns. They were painting verbs, but reframes the 8 legs completely. If your whole understanding of an animal is bound up in how it moves, then a drawing that cannot move is not a beautiful abstraction. It is an incomplete sentence. Multiplying the legs is not a failure of realism. It is a solution to a problem: how to fit time into a shape. And once you begin trying to fit time into a shape, you are already standing at the edge of animation. All that remains is to let something spin, or let the firelight do it for you. So what were the discs? This is the point where the story stops giving straight answers and gets stranger. The obvious guess is that they were toys. Small, portable, endlessly repeatable, delightful. And there is a reason not to dismiss children from this picture. Caves preserve footprints, and among the prints found in Paleolithic caves are those of children, small feet in soft clay hundreds of meters underground, sometimes alongside adult prints, sometimes accompanied by the paw prints of wolves or dogs walking the same passage. Children were in these places. They were not left at the entrance. But calling something a toy explains less than it seems to. Play is how humans of every era rehearse the world. A device that makes an animal stand up and lie down at the turn of a wrist is a way of practicing the most valuable skill a young hunter can learn: reading a body in motion before it is close enough to matter. Then there is the second possibility, and it is harder to look at directly. At a cave called Enlen in the Pyrenees, excavators found something puzzling: rondelles and other worked bone objects that had been deliberately broken, not worn out, not damaged in the ground, snapped, and in some cases the fragments placed into the earth of the cave floor. Whatever those discs were for, part of their purpose seems to have involved ending them. An object that makes a dead animal rise, held in the flickering dark of a cave, then broken and buried, does not sit comfortably in the category of plaything. But neither can we call it religion, because we have no idea what these people believed, and inventing a belief system for them would be exactly the mistake the last 2 centuries kept making. There is a third possibility, quieter and perhaps more likely, that these objects were part of telling stories. Azima argued that a great deal of Paleolithic imagery is narrative, that panels of animals do not merely depict a scene, but unfold, with sequence and direction, and that the artists had ways of showing before and after. If a group sitting around a fire had a small disc that could make a creature rise and settle, then someone holding it was doing something we would recognize instantly, illustrating a story with a moving image. And there is a fourth possibility, which is the honest one, that the category does not exist in our language. That toy, ritual object, teaching aid, and storytelling device are 4 modern boxes being held up to an object that belonged to none of them, because it came from a world where those distinctions had not yet been invented. We may be trying to classify something whose meaning was never separable from a way of living we cannot enter. What is not in doubt is what all of this says about the minds involved, and here the implications get large. To make a thaumatrope work, a person has to hold several ideas simultaneously: that a picture can stand for a real animal, that 2 pictures can stand for the same animal at different moments, that the eye can be deceived, deliberately, by controlling what it sees and when, that an effect experienced once can be engineered to happen again, on demand, by an object designed for the purpose. Yeah, that last one is the quiet giant. It is the same logic that underlies every machine humans have ever built. Notice a natural effect, then construct a device whose only function is to produce that effect reliably. The spinning disc is not merely art, it is an instrument. And it belongs to the same period as some of the earliest evidence of humans thinking in sequences. Bone plaques marked with rows of notches, engraved lines grouped in patterns that some researchers suspect track lunar cycles or seasons, a debated idea but a serious one. What all of these share is the treatment of time as something that can be laid out, divided, and represented, not lived through, but handled, which leads to the collision at the heart of this entire story. The rondelles of the Magdalenian world are roughly 12 to 17,000 years old. The paintings of Chauvet are more than twice that age. Writing, the first true writing, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay in Mesopotamia, appears around 5,000 years ago. Line those numbers up and something extraordinary emerges. If Ozima is right, then human beings were engineering the illusion of movement thousands of years before anybody worked out how to write down the word for it. The moving image would not be the newest of our media. It would be among the oldest. Cinema would not be an invention of the industrial age, but a rediscovery, a technique that surfaced, was practiced in Firelight, and then vanished so completely that when it returned it looked brand new. There is a strange symmetry in the geography too. The rock shelters of the Vézère, the painted chambers of the Ardèche, the toy makers of 19th century Paris, Reynaud theater of mirrors, the Lumière brothers in that cafe basement. France appears to have invented moving pictures twice, separated by roughly 14,000 years, and had no idea the first time it happened. When 4 teenagers stumbled into Lascaux in 1940, cinemas were already selling tickets a few hours train ride away. But be careful with the word invented, because the honest conclusion is narrower and, in a way, more interesting. Nobody has proved that any Ice Age person ever spun a bone disc. The wear marks are ambiguous. The extra legs may sometimes be accidents of accumulation. The Firelight experiments show what these images could have looked like, not what anyone intended them to look like. Every step of the argument is a reasonable reading of evidence that will never speak plainly, because the people who could settle it have been silent for 15,000 years. What the evidence does establish is harder to dismiss. That these humans possessed the same visual system we do, with the same motion circuitry primed to see movement in sequence. That they made images by flickering light, in darkness, on curved surfaces, in conditions where stillness was impossible. That they drew animals with repeated limbs and doubled heads far too often for coincidence to carry all of it, and that at least one of them engraved the same creature twice, in 2 positions on opposite faces of a disc with a hole through the middle. Perhaps the most likely truth is not invention at all, but something more human. Not a genius who devised animation, but a great many people who noticed it, over and over, in different valleys and different centuries, because it was impossible not to notice if you spent your evenings making pictures by a fire. Discovered, enjoyed, used, and then simply not written down, because there was nothing to write with. Which leaves a final thought, and it is not a comfortable one. We tend to imagine progress as a line, primitive, then advanced, grunts, then language, scratches, then art, stillness, then motion. It is a flattering shape, because it puts us at the top of it, but the evidence from the Ice Age keeps refusing that shape. These were not people slowly climbing toward imagination. They had all of it already: perspective, narrative, anatomy, symbolism, portable art, music from bone flutes, and quite possibly the deliberate manufacture of illusion. What they lacked was not mind, it was accumulation. No writing to fix a discovery in place, no institutions to carry it, no way for a good idea found in one valley to reach the next one after the person who had it died. So things were found, and lost, and found again, for tens of thousands of years. Somewhere in that long darkness, a person sat by a fire, holding a small bone disc between 2 cords, and made an animal rise from the ground and settle again, rise and settle, for as long as their fingers kept turning. Whoever was watching had no word for what they were seeing. No word for image, or illusion, or moment, and still, in the flicker, something stood up that they knew perfectly well was not alive. The question is not really whether they invented animation. The question is how many times our species has invented it, and how much else we once knew, and set down, and forgot, in the 14,000 years before anybody thought to write it on a wall.